Good evening and welcome to another episode of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Melissa Whitecross, and I'm streaming to you live from Johannesburg, South Africa. A big thank you to my co-host, Andrew de Block, for holding down the fort over the past few weeks. Andrew is currently on his way back from the Cape, and we look forward to bringing him back onto the show next week when he'll be in the hot seat presenting a talk on the ethics of birding. But tonight, my colleague Linda van den Heever is going to showcase some of our important vulture work being carried out across Africa to protect our highly threatened vultures. And before we dive into Linda's exciting webinar, we have a few announcements and some housekeeping rules. If you'd like to communicate with us this evening, please use the Zoom chat room, and remember to select all panelists and attendees if you want everyone listening to be able to see your message. Please ask your questions of the speaker by using the Q&A box throughout the webinar. And if you're watching us on Facebook Live, you can use the comment feed for your comments and questions. Our speaker will answer these at the end of the webinar. We do love hearing from all of you, so let us know you are tuning in on all major social media channels by using the hashtag Conservation Conversations. If you've missed out on any of our previous episodes, you can catch up with the recordings on the BirdLife South Africa YouTube channel, or listen to them via our podcast, available on all major streaming services. We'd like to encourage all of you listening to please visit our YouTube channel and click the subscribe button, as this helps us grow our support for our webinar content. Now, a big thank you to those of you who continue to generously donate towards the production of these webinars using the Cricket Donations platform. Simply scan the QR code using your phone camera or visit the Conservation Conversations website to find the link to the donations portal. Your contributions help us to keep these talks free for all to learn and enjoy. Now, Outliers Coffee are roasting for a cause in support of BirdLife South Africa's landscape conservation program and some of the work that you'll be seeing this evening. And this includes work that we do to conserve our most threatened birds and habitats in South Africa. Get your very own Dawn Chorus coffee as grounds or whole beans in 250 grams or 1 kilogram packets online today. You can see the link at the bottom of your screen, and if you click it, you can enjoy the fresh, delicious kickstart to your day that every early birder needs. Proceeds from all of these sales will go to our conservation work, and we encourage all of our viewers watching to buy their own Dawn Chorus coffee from Outliers Coffee today. It's certainly the way that I like to start my day. BirdLife South Africa's 5th virtual Learn About Birds conference, or LAB as we affectionately know it, will run on the 27th and 28th of May this year through the Zoom platform. The deadline for early bird registrations is fast approaching, and this is a cheaper price than a standard registration, which will kick in on 1st of April. Registrations can be carried out through the BirdLife South Africa website, and the details of that are on the bottom of your screen. There'll be a dedicated science lab taking place from 8:30 in the morning until 3:30 in the afternoon on each of the days. And this will be followed by 2 layman's lectures in the evenings, one starting at 5 o'clock and one starting at 7 o'clock South African Standard Time. And you can register for either both of these events, or if you're enjoying these webinars and you are most interested in the layman's lectures, you can register to just attend layman's lab in the evenings. To find out more and to register and pay for this event, please visit BirdLife South Africa's website or email lab2021@birdlife.org.za. Our 2021 AGM is also going virtual this year and will be held on 29 May. To register for this important event, please visit the Flock page on the BirdLife South Africa website, and this can be found under the Events tab. You can also email flock2021@birdlife.org.za. There's still a few places on our joint Chobe River trips with CMP Safaris, so be sure to visit our website and find out more about this amazing opportunity to go out with one of our former speakers, Lo Pitzer, and his company, and enjoy some of the incredible photographic opportunities that the Chobe River has to offer. We'd also like to remind everyone that our South African Listers Club is on the website, and if you have seen 300 or more species in our diverse country, we would love you to join and update your totals on a regular basis. If you're already a member, just visit the webpage and you can update your totals on the same link. Now tonight, we welcome Linda van den Heever back for her second Conservation Conversations webinar. Linda and a panel of colleagues, Linda joined us last year with a panel of colleagues to talk about the impact of lead on vultures. And I'd like to encourage those of you who missed that talk to watch it on our YouTube channel. Linda is BirdLife South Africa's Vulture Project Manager and is working hard to secure important sites as vulture safe zones across South Africa, with the most recent declaration of the Zululand Vulture Safe Zone taking place on International Vulture Day last year on the 5th of September. In addition to this, Linda represents BirdLife South Africa on the National Vulture Task Force, as well as the National Wildlife Poison Prevention Working Group, the National Lead Task Team, which is a sub-working group of the National Wildlife Poison Prevention Working Group, and the Bearded Vulture Recovery Program, where she brings her expertise in mitigating the impacts of lead on wildlife, in particular our vultures, raptors, and large terrestrial birds. Now, I must also commend Linda on her dedication and drive to carry out all of her conservation duties, in addition to completing a PhD at the University of Pretoria, and we wish her all the best in furthering her studies to complete that PhD. Linda seems to enjoy collecting degrees, as she is certainly good at it, holding a BSc Honours in Zoology, and prior to that, securing a degree both in accounting and applied mathematics. So Linda is certainly one smart cookie, and we're very glad to have her on the team with us. Now, Linda, we are extremely excited to have you with us this evening. I'm going to allow you to share your slides in the meantime, and I'm going to switch myself off, and we really do look forward to what you have to say to us tonight. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Melissa, for that lovely introduction. Please just give me a sec while I set myself up on this side. There we go. All right. It's really lovely to be back tonight, and I'm even more keen to present on a topic, that focuses less on the doom and gloom of vulture declines or the controversy of lead poisoning in vultures, and more to focus on, the very unique ecosystem services that they bring to our planet. So I'm going to throw a lot of information at you tonight, and I'll try to get through it as timeously as possible. But please, if you have any questions towards the end, please pop them in the chat box or even email me afterwards. I will make sure to follow up on all of it. So let's get started. So I think we'll all agree that this is not a face that generates tender feelings. Evolution has trained us to dislike death and everything associated with that. And that's good. We should avoid death as much as possible. Unfortunately, it is a part of life, and nature had to come up with various solutions to make sure that the bodies don't pile up, and to make sure that the nutrients that are encased in all of our bodies are actually recycled when we do die. So enter the scavengers, and that's why scavengers evolved. And vultures are surely the most, at the top of the scavenger guild, the most unique of all the scavengers. Unfortunately, they get a raw deal because of their line of work, their interests, so to speak, and the way they look. They've come to stand, unfortunately, for everything that is conniving or evil or disgusting or ugly, putrid and smelly. But this afternoon, when I went over my notes for the last time, I couldn't help thinking, that if we do start to resemble the animals that we work with, then I am already exhibiting the signs. And I can already tell you that this on the left is me on a good day. That in the middle is me when the children in my complex go ape crazy, and it drives me crazy. And then on the right, that's me when I hear that people are still shooting with lead ammunition. What irks me the most, quite frankly, and irritates me no end, is that even politicians are likened to vultures. And I find that so unfair. A quick search on the internet will, for instance, deliver this, as you've got Boris Johnson and his cronies and the members of the EU, silently and patiently watching Theresa May as she stumbles towards the Brexit deal. Or you've got the Democrats patiently waiting for Donald Trump to commit political suicide. Or most disturbingly of all, you've got Vice President Kamala Harris patiently waiting for the 78-year-old Biden to kick the bucket. So I think other than sharks and possibly leeches, it is difficult to think of another group of animals that is used more to depict what is worst in humanity. And all that we're really doing is to exhibit our own prejudices, because I can tell you now that would not have been the case had they looked like this. And I can promise you now, with that little robin covered in blood and gore, it would not look so hot either. Unfortunately, politicians are not becoming as rare as vultures. 9 of South Africa's vulture, of the 9 vulture species in South Africa, 4 are critically endangered, and they are fast disappearing from our landscapes. But as I was irritatingly asked in this wimpy in Ermelo on my way to Zululand about 2 years ago, why would I want to spend my life conserving a species that is so ugly and disgusting? Well, I'm here tonight to tell you why. First of all, existence is not reserved for the beautiful and the appealing. And second of all, vultures are bloody useful. And that is the purpose of this talk tonight. So a little bit of background. Wildlife, domestic animals, and humans have always interacted to some degree, as far as back as human history goes. But in modern society, we have now created a world where the overlap between these three groups become ever more diffuse. And this is due to a number of reasons. First and foremost, it's due to explosive exponential human population growth. And because of that, we produce ever more organic waste. We need to intensify our agriculture to feed all those mouths. We have to build more houses in order to house all those people. Global travel has become more and more affordable to more and more people, and we are translocating across borders ever more animals. If we're honest with ourselves, that graph should actually look more like that, with wildlife more and more retreating into the minority. But for the sake of simplicity, I will keep the graph in the proportions that it is. So diseases exist on a continuum. They very rarely influence one group of on this graph exclusively. So for instance, Ebola will make the jump from primates to humans, so that it will affect both groups in equal measure. Similarly, with something like canine distemper, who will influence wildlife and domestic animals. What is vital for us, and certainly in view of recent events, are the so-called zoonotic diseases. And those are the diseases that can make the jump either from wildlife to humans or from domestic animals to humans. And the purpose of this review was to find out what the role is that vultures play in this whole relationship, and what would happen if we had to finally face a world where we have to live without them. So a little bit of background on vultures itself. And they exist on every continent except Antarctica, and for some reason, bizarre reason, Australia. The Old World vultures consist of 16 species, and the New World vultures consist of 7 species. Although these two groups are superficially similar, they have simply evolved to fill the same ecological niche, and they're not really closely related. So they're a bit like swifts and swallows in that sense. The Old World vultures are more closely related to the accipiters, which are the hawks and the eagles. The New World vultures were once thought to be closely related to storks, but that is now disputed, and quite frankly, academics can't seem to reach any kind of consensus on where those birds fit in the evolutionary system. So tonight, I'm going to talk about 6 topics. First of all, I'm going to look at the scavenger guild in general. I'm then going to look at the adaptations that they evolved to do what they do. I'm going to look at the role of vultures and why we think that they play a central role in the prevention of disease. I'm going to try and put some monetary value on the role of vultures. And I'm also going to look at a new framework called One Health and the possible role that vultures can be playing in that. So first of all, the scavenger guild. The scavenger guild are by biologists divided into 2 main groups, and those are the obligate scavengers and the facultative scavengers. Obligate scavengers relies entirely, or shall I say almost entirely, on carrion as a source of food, whereas the facultative scavengers are opportunistic scavengers, and they can also be quite effective hunters in their own right. Vultures are the only known terrestrial obligate scavengers on the planet, whereas the facultative scavengers come from numerous groups represented by the mammals and other birds. And they can include animals such as jackals, hyenas, feral dogs, rats, as well as the crows and even other raptors. But in case we get too fixated on the vertebrates themselves, we should also not forget that the smaller creatures, such as the millions of species of bacteria and invertebrates, also play a crucial role in the scavenger guild. So in South Africa, we've got 9 species of vultures. I only depict 7 here, the most common 7. All of them are obligate scavengers, with the exception of the palm nut vulture, who mainly feeds on fruit. Of our facultative scavengers with the mammals, we're looking at examples here. We have the spotted hyena, as well as the side-striped hyena, the brown hyena, as well as the black-backed jackal, which is maybe one of the major irritations of any livestock farmer alive today. In terms of the birds, we've got species like Vulture and the yellow-billed kite and the tawny eagle, which are frequently seen at Carcasses, as well as the marabou stork, and then also crows, especially the pied crow, which is quickly becoming a scourge of areas such as the Karoo. For the purposes of this discussion, we should also not forget species such as the great white pelican and the white stork. They are frequently seen at landfill sites in their hundreds, where they feed on human organic waste. And in that sense, they also play important roles in the scavenger guild. So in terms of scavengers and their adaptations, I'm going to start with the vultures first. So carcasses in themselves, they're an ephemeral source of food, and they're often very widely distributed and unpredictable. So in order to detect those carcasses and to exploit them, vultures have evolved a set of very unique characteristics that help them to do that. First of all, they evolved soaring flight, and that helps them to cover vast distances in a very short space of time, and by expending very little energy. Those who have seen a vulture flap will agree that it's not a pretty sight. They live for the thermals and for soaring flight, and that is what they do best. They also manage to detect carcasses very quickly by relying on social cues. So they will monitor other vultures and raptors very closely to see where these birds are going down, possibly to sources of food. The old world vultures have evolved very keen eyesight to detect carcasses very quickly. This is different in the New World vultures. New World vultures, such as the turkey vulture, instead have evolved very keen senses of smell, because they occur mostly in forests where keen eyesight will really not be of very good use to you. Vultures are also capable of very rapid consumption, and as I'm sure anyone who's been to Kruger will know, that the competition at Carcasses between vultures are extremely fierce. They've evolved the ability to consume as much as 20% of their body weight and still be able to take off. So if you put that into human perspective, if you take a guy that weighs 80 kilograms, that means you can consume 16 kilograms of food, of your own weight in food in one sitting, which is just absolutely remarkable. Importantly for our talk tonight, they've also evolved an extremely acidic stomach. And that not only helps them to consume tough items such as bones or ligaments, but also to get rid of very pathogenic bacteria, which is very important because they do tend to feed off fraught things, let's be honest. Recent studies, very interestingly, on the black vulture and the turkey vulture in the US have shown that they've also evolved very unique mutualistic relationships with the bacteria found on their facial skin and in their large intestines. Researchers have found bacteria such as Clostridia and Fusobacteria. So those are typical soil bacteria, and they, to someone like you and me, that would be highly toxic. But for some reason, they've evolved a mutualistic relationship with the bacteria in their intestines, receiving a reliable source of food, and the vultures benefiting from the bacteria breaking down whatever toxic substances they have absorbed. Bizarrely, they've also found invertebrate predators in their intestines, which prey on dead bacteria and other pathogens, which obviously help them to deal with harmful substances. On their facial skin, and I find this incredible, they've tracked down bacteria such as Hylomonella gracilis, which can prevent the long-term persistence of Yersinia pestis. And Yersinia pestis is the bacteria that causes the Black Plague. And they've also found genes that have very unique insecticidal, fungicidal, and antiparasitic properties, which is, I think, absolutely fantastic. And I think this just highlights the role that vultures play in cleaning up carcasses and bacteria that will be pathogenic to any other organisms that haven't evolved the same adaptations. Whether the old world vultures, that's our vultures, have evolved similar capabilities is still uncertain. But it could very well be that convergent evolution has given them the same adaptations. Moving on to our facultative scavengers, I'm going to look at brown hyena, or the hyenas and the jackals first. And they are equally well-adapted hunters and scavengers. So hyenas, for instance, have got big crushing teeth and very strong jaws that allows them to crush bones and to extract nutrients from even the oldest of bones. These animals also have adapted very well to carcasses or organic waste, and because of that, they've adapted very well to human habitation, to the irritation of many a farmer. Unfortunately, things like the jackal are also highly mobile, and that's got major implications for disease transmission. They're also very aggressive, not only to members of their own species, but also to members of other species. And they are very important disease vectors, as we'll see later, especially for diseases like rabies and canine distemper. I'm going to talk about rats briefly. I'm not going to talk about them again, but obviously they are very well adapted to human habitats. What made them proliferate to such an extent is because they've got such a generous diet. And of course, they are incredibly important vectors of disease, including Yersinia pestis, as I mentioned earlier, which causes the Black Plague. In terms of our avian scavengers, we're looking at species such as crows, storks, and other raptors. They can congregate in massive numbers at carcasses and landfills. Where they play a beneficial role, they consume mass amounts of organic waste, but they can transmit bacteria such as Salmonella, as well as the botulism toxin, which can have major implications for our water quality. I want to pay special attention to a very important facultative scavenger, the feral dog. In many developing countries, the feral dog has now become the most abundant carnivore. And they are obviously abandoned, and they are invariably unvaccinated, and they can play havoc on local ecosystems. Unfortunately, they also breed without restriction, and because they lack proper nutrition, they will resort to scavenging. And with the increase in edible waste, because of human population growth, they can just expand in size limitless. And obviously, they completely lack veterinary care, which is very concerning. What makes dogs special is that they are the one species that can travel freely between those three groups: the wildlife, the livestock, and the humans. And as such, they can become very effective conduits for disease, as we'll discuss later. Moving on to the role of vultures in the prevention of disease. This role can take on two forms. It's either through direct prevention by removing carcasses and organic waste from the environment, or through indirect prevention by regulating the numbers of mammalian scavengers. I'll look at direct prevention first. Decomposition is a slow process, but a carcass can form a nutrient-rich source of food for a wide variety of organisms. So, contrary to popular belief, if I die tonight, the first animal that will consume me is not my cat. It will be the bacteria that's in my gut that is already consuming whatever I had for dinner. So that's a rather pleasant thought, but the fact is, the moment my heart stops beating, the bacteria in my stomach and in my intestines will start consuming me. And what they will invariably do, these bacteria will start releasing toxins because they want to compete with each other, and they also want to prevent mammalian scavengers from consuming that carcass, my carcass in this instance. So bacteria, once they start consuming you, this will quickly be followed by the bacteria in the soil around you, and that will quickly be followed by various types of worms, nematode worms, various types of fungi, as well as also the insects such as blowflies. And they will use this carcass environment as a reliable place to deposit their eggs, and then their larvae will feed off the flesh of the animal that has died. As I said earlier, this is a very slow process if it's left to its own devices, but this process is greatly accelerated by the presence of scavengers such as mammals and vultures, particularly vultures. This was illustrated quite clearly a couple of years ago by a study they did in the US, where they looked at black and turkey vultures, and they put a number of rabbit carcasses out in the environment, and they experimentally excluded vultures from some of these carcasses. And they found, once they've done that, that there was a 10-fold increase in the number of carcasses that were not fully scavenged. And they found that in particular, in the very hot and humid months of summer, that microbial activity increased and that carcass decompositions times increased with it, which meant that mammalian scavengers could not functionally compensate for the loss of vultures. And that, of course, raises the risk of disease evolving in those carcasses. This is of particular interest in the current topic of climate change, with temperatures in Africa set to increase by 2 degrees by 2100. You cannot help but think that if microbial activity increases accordingly, what would the role of vultures be in preventing this from becoming a massive problem? So moving on to the indirect ways in which vultures will prevent disease transmission, I want to quickly say a couple of words about something that we biologists call competitive regulation. So what you've got pictured there is a very basic predator-prey dynamic. At the top, you've got your apex predator, followed by your intermediate predator, or what we call your mesopredator, and finally you've got your poor prey species that have to deal with both of those predator species. The apex predator will regulate the number of mesopredators, not only by competing with them for resources, but also by predating on those species themselves. So if for some reason that apex predator should disappear, that mesopredator would now find itself in a position where it's got additional resources, it's got additional territory, and they will increase in numbers. And we call that competitive release. So vultures are believed to fulfill a similar role within the scavenger guild. And for that reason, we call them apex scavengers, with the theory being that vultures as apex scavengers will regulate mammalian scavenger numbers, which will result in efficient carcass disposal and reduce the risk of disease. If, and by that token, do competitive regulation on those mammalian scavengers. If for some reason these vultures will decline, you will rapidly see changes in the scavenger composition through this competitive release. So the number of mammalian scavengers will increase because they will now step into the void left by the vultures, and they will exploit that ecological niche. So what you will find invariably that there's an increase sorry, I just need to move my face so that I can see what I've said here. You will see an increase in contact between mammalian scavengers, which will facilitate the spread of viruses and parasites. By the same token, you will see increased carcass composition times, and which will facilitate the development of pathogenic bacteria. And all of this together will increase the risk to humans, wildlife, and livestock. So this theory was tested by Darcy Agada and her team in Kenya a couple of years ago, where she experimentally excluded vultures from a couple of carcasses. And what she saw was the carcass decomposition times, the numbers of mammals present at carcasses, the amount of time spent by mammals at carcasses, and the number of contacts between mammals increased threefold when vultures were absent. And that just opens the room for all sorts of problems because we, as I mentioned earlier, mammalian scavengers are so aggressive, and they even predate on each other, and that will create the roots for disease transmission to occur. Similar things happened in India a couple of decades ago, 3 or 4 decades ago, what you see there would have been a common sight. Vultures were in their hundreds of thousands responsible for the consumption not only of organic waste, but also of livestock carcasses. But then with the introduction of the veterinary drug diclofenac, vultures were basically decimated, and more than 90% of the population were destroyed as a result. What happened then is when the vultures disappeared, the numbers of feral dogs exploded. And I think at one site they counted that in 9 years, the numbers of feral dogs increased from 60 to 1,200. And as you can see on that photograph, even though those dogs may appear very well fed, they're not very healthy. And that raises many concerns. So I'm going to briefly look at the types of diseases that we suspect vultures might be able to regulate. Some are bacterial diseases, some are viral diseases, as well as some parasites. Obviously, what I'm going to cover here is just a sample, and there's so much detail, and I think maybe at the end you will thank me for not going into too much detail because it can be a bit gory. One of the most important bacterial diseases to look at is obviously anthrax. Anthrax can cause mass mortalities in herbivores. The photograph that you see there was taken a couple of years ago in the Okavango, where an outbreak killed hundreds of hippo. So anthrax in the body, it occurs in the bloodstream, and we call that the vegetative form. When an animal dies, the gut bacteria of that animal will very quickly destroy anthrax. So most often it is advised not to open a carcass that we know have died of anthrax. But obviously in a natural environment, we know that is not always the case. So what will happen as soon as anthrax is exposed to a drier environment, it will form spores. And those spores are incredibly hardy, and it will go into the soil where it can remain for decades. So obviously the first question here is, well, will vultures not then promote spore formation by opening a carcass? And the question is yes, but my answer to that is also that if there are enough vultures and they get rid of the carcass very quickly, as we know vultures can, then that will not leave enough time for anthrax to actually form spores. And studies in Kruger National Park, of all places, have actually shown that blowfly activity have been implicated more in anthrax transmission than scavengers such as vultures or even jackal. Another very important disease to look at is bovine tuberculosis, BTB. It is caused by Mycobacterium bovis, and it is very economically significant, as we all know. Unfortunately, it can also be transferred from dead game or livestock by mammalian scavengers, and we call that horizontal transmission. And it has been shown that in areas where there's low carnivore densities, that BTB has less chance of transmitting. So the obvious conclusion is that should mammalian scavengers increase in number, the risk of BTB transmission from dead animals to live animals is much higher. And importantly for humans, BTB very frequently manifests in patients that suffer from HIV, and I'll discuss that in more detail later. One of the most important viral diseases to discuss is obviously rabies. It's caused by one of the lyssaviruses. It requires direct contact between predators because it's transmitted in the saliva, and it causes fatal encephalitis in both humans and animals. And is prevalent wherever there are large populations of humans and domestic or feral dogs. According to the World Health Organization, 77% of human rabies, the mortality is in Africa and Asia, in the developing countries. And it's particularly prevalent amongst children. And surprise, surprise, 95% of those incidents are caused by dog bites. And again, the implication being that should dog numbers increase, as we've seen in India, the implications for rabies transmission could be significant. Another very important viral disease is canine distemper, and canine distemper can decimate carnivore populations wherever it occurs. It also requires direct contact between predators, and it is particularly significant where human encroachment occurs upon nature reserves, as you can see there. That satellite shot is a shot of southern Kruger, which borders on Bushbuck Ridge. And if feral dogs penetrate into the nature reserves, as we know they do, the risk of transmission of canine distemper to wild predator populations will be increased. And of course, that is of particular significance to endangered species, such as our wild dogs. Looking at parasites, and why this is significant for us is that feral dogs will get into contact with our companion animals, such as our cats and our dogs, and those cats and dogs will carry those parasites into the human habitation. So some of the ectoparasites that we look at are mites, ticks, and fleas, which in themselves are little more than mere nuisances. But of course, the big danger here is they are the vectors for very infectious diseases. Some of the endoparasites that we're looking at, and this is the real nasty stuff that we're getting to, is something like leishmania, which is not well known, but is monitored very closely by WHO. It's a single-celled organism that is transmitted by sandflies. It occurs particularly in dogs, and they're the major reservoir. And so far in the world, there's about 12 million people infected, with this further 350 million people at risk of infection. In Africa so far, it's only limited to Northern Africa, but the main concern here is that it could be facilitated its spread by the mobility of pets across our borders. Another particularly nasty thing is something called Toxocare, or a roundworm. It's mainly carried by dogs and to a lesser extent by cats. And in humans, it will attack the lungs, the liver, as well as the central nervous system. Another thing is called schistosoma, so-called blood flukes, which can cause symptoms from mild irritation to severe infections in the gut. We're also looking at things like trypanosoma, which is transmitted by the tsetse fly and causes fatal sleeping sickness in humans. And then there's your garden variety tapeworm and its cousin, which is particularly nasty, Echinococcus, which can cause cysts in the gut, in the digestive system, and as well as other organs, and can lead to anaphylactic shock in many humans. So most of these parasites can cause mild symptoms from diarrhea to anemia that can also cause major organ failure, abortion, and even death. So if your butt starts itching, you can't say I didn't warn you. So no discussion on the prevention of disease can be complete without also considering vultures as possible transmitters of disease. Vultures can transmit disease, and they can carry spores on their feathers and in their vomit, as well as their poo and on their feet. The studies on this are not many, but some of the examples that I have found have implicated vultures possibly as transmitters of anthrax spores. But as I mentioned earlier, that studies have shown that blowflies are actually a higher risk of transmitting anthrax spores. They can also transmit things like brucellosis. Parasite eggs, such as the Toxocare I showed you earlier, their eggs can actually pass through the vulture's digestive system intact. And in fact, studies in Croatia have found these eggs in the excrement of the griffin vulture, which is a close cousin of our whiteback vulture. Griffin vultures have also been implemented in the transfer of salmonella. And what happens here, happens at pig farms in humans, where the remains of pigs are left out for the vultures to feed on, and then they get infected with salmonella and they transfer it to other pig farms. And so the bacteria is transferred. And then it's also been found that bacteria such as Streptococcus can pass through a vulture's intestines intact. So they can transmit diseases, but obviously this needs to be offset against the very real benefits that they can bring in the prevention of disease. So now we're going to try and look at the cost of vulture declines. Studies of this is also few and far between, but I will highlight this as I go along. In terms of human healthcare, especially in India, with the increase in feral dogs and the possible increase in rabies as a result of that, they've calculated that the cost of that has amounted to $1.5 billion per year. You know, you need to keep that, you must also consider that in the perspective of the earning potential of people who live in those countries. If you look at people in Africa, you know, the rabies vaccination costs in the region of $45, whereas the average salary can be less than $2 a day, and that's just not feasible. Bovine tuberculosis, which I mentioned earlier, can cause opportunistic infections in people with HIV. And sub-Saharan Africa, as we know, is at the center of the HIV pandemic. And they reckon that about 70% of those people already have opportunistic infections of BTB. If you look at countries like South Africa, where the average treatment per patient per month for antiretrovirals, for doctor's visits, all of that is about $100 per patient. And that excludes treatment for secondary infections such as BTB. And it could have some very real implications in that sense. Calculations have shown that between 2015 and 2050, that just to maintain the current levels of HIV treatment will cost in the region of $98 million. And that will come from foreign aid. And that can increase drastically if the secondary infections, because of all these other diseases should increase. If you look at veterinary costs, this has not really been quantified, but things that you should include are obviously the cost of vaccination programs, general veterinary care to get rid of all those parasites which will infect animals, surveillance programs, veterinary fences have to be put up to prevent naive animals from being infected by things like BTB, and then obviously veterinary checkpoints, such as this one that in Namibia, which are a frequent site to check for foot-and-mouth disease. In the USA, it has been calculated that they spent in the region of $300 million in the detection, prevention, and control of rabies in wild animals, and the vaccination of that alone amounts to $150 million. In continents such as Africa, there is just not that kind of money to deal with these issues. Obviously, we cannot look at the cost of vulture declines without also considering the loss of livelihoods. You know, if herds become infected, the demand for products may decrease, trade sanctions may be imposed, and there will may also be requirements for mandatory culling. I think the most research has been done on the sanitation services that vultures provide. In Yemen, on the island of Socotra, you find the densest population of Egyptian vultures in the world. And it is calculated that they consume close to 248 metric tons of organic human waste per year. In West and Central Africa, hooded vultures are regularly seen at abattoirs, markets, and rubbish dumps. They also feed on human excrement. In the 1970s, it was calculated that vultures and marabou stork, between them, consume close to 100,000 kilograms per year of organic waste. This has not been quantified, and I think that must be one of the most massive research gaps in our understanding of the role that vultures play in possible disease prevention. What we know, we must infer from studies that have been done abroad. In North and South America, it has been calculated that the 13 million turkey vultures that occupy those two continents, that they deliver close to $700 million in cleanup services per year, which is not to be sniffed at. What we must also look at is the possible cost of the industrial destruction of carcasses. When the EU imposed the requirement that farmers must have their carcasses destroyed by industrial processes following the outbreak of BSE, they quickly learned that the industrial destruction of carcasses cost between 66 and 96 euros per ton. Vultures remove close to 9.9 million tons per year, and that could save farmers in the region of 20 euros per animal. They also calculated that following these restrictions, that atmospheric emissions increased by 78,000 tons per year in Spain alone. And obviously that will have implications for human health in the long run, which will incur additional healthcare costs. We also have to consider the cultural services that vultures provide, not only in terms of aesthetics, in terms of removing things that are smelly and unpleasant, but also in terms of ecotourism, and especially in religious ceremonies in communities such as the Parsi in India, who relied on vultures quite heavily to remove the bodies of the dead as part of their belief system. And they now, following the decline of vultures in India, had to resort to other measures to do that. And then also in terms of Africa, their role in traditional medicine. So I think considering all of those things, these interactions are complex, and that the real contribution, I think, that vultures make to our livelihoods will never be accurately quantified. I want to briefly look at the role that vultures play in something called One Health. Scientists are more and more moving away from the concept that human health, animal health, and environmental health is something that should be compartmentalized and dealt with separately. And instead of that, they're moving more towards a viewpoint that recognizes the fact that all of these things are interconnected, and that you really can't look at human health, for instance, without also considering animal health and the environmental health in which they live. So One Health is a new approach that is designed to make sure that we find cross-cutting solutions, to make sure that researchers that work on these three groups, that they share information, to make sure that we all work together to make sure that we achieve better and more effective public health outcomes. This is also underscored by the Eyesight targets that were set forth by the Convention on Biological Diversity. There are 20 of them, and number 14 actually calls for the restoration of ecosystem services. And vultures, in the role that they play in the prevention of disease, in removing carcasses, in regulating the number of mammalian scavengers, very much play a very important role in that framework. Sorry, my cat just pulled down some artwork, which I'll check the damage later. So, in conclusion, I am the first to admit that there are massive research gaps in our understanding of this dynamic. I do, however, believe that in terms of the persistence of carcasses in the absence of vultures, in the competitive regulation of vultures on different mammalian scavengers, we have anecdotal evidence that vultures do play a very significant limiting effect on the spread of zoonotic diseases. So vultures could step in where human resources cannot. And this is particularly relevant, I think, for the developing world, where lack of funds, political instability, and inadequate surveillance frequently prevent governments from providing even the most basic services to their citizens. With the human population set to reach 9 billion in the next 9 years, I think we must quickly make hay and realize that we need to protect our disease regulating species. So my hope after this talk is that the next time that you see this disgustingly beautiful gory face, that you will change your attitude and actually appreciate what they do for us. And I think my sincerest wish is that eventually we'll reach the point where calling someone a vulture is actually a compliment. Before I close off, I just want to quickly mention that this review was the result of 4 meetings that I had the great honor of attending, which was hosted by the Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center in Annapolis in the US. And I am deeply grateful to this group of people who helped me in drafting this paper that have now been accepted for publication in the Journal of Raptor Research. So all that is left for me to do is to thank my sponsors, particularly the Isdale Family Foundation and the Mary Oppenheimer and Daughters Foundation, who fund my work at BirdLife South Africa, as well as the Ford Wildlife Foundation, whose bucky gets me where I need to be. I also want to thank all the photographers and websites that I ripped off in the creation of this presentation. I acknowledged your contribution wherever I could, but please forgive me if I did not. Thank you, Melissa, over to you.
Thank you so much, Linda. That was absolutely phenomenal. And I can see just how much time and effort you've put into constructing that webinar. So thank you so much for all of the effort that you put into sharing that incredible story with all of us tonight. It is absolutely awesome to see the role that these birds play and to see how much work you and the Succinct team have put into ensuring that these details are captured. And before we dive into a set of questions, I can see them rolling in thick and fast. So I hope you're ready, Linda. Just a reminder to everyone, when you exit the webinar this evening, you're going to be directed to a post-webinar survey. It takes about 2 minutes to complete, and we'd really appreciate it if you'd spend the time just to fill that in for us. And a reminder that next week, my co-host Andrew de Block will be in the hot seat, but he's organized an amazing panel of speakers to join him to talk about the ethics of bird watching. And some of the panelists that he's lined up include the likes of Vincent Ward, Dr. Callan Cohen, as well as Etienne Marais, all well-established bird guides in South Africa's birding community. And I'd highly, highly recommend that you tune in for that. It's going to be an absolutely fascinating debate. But Linda, I think to kick us off for our first question this evening, we've got a question from one of your funders, and it's great to have honorary patron Pamela Isdell tuned in, and I'm assuming that Neville, her husband, who funds your position, is sitting alongside her. So a big welcome to you, Pamela and Neville, and thank you so much for the support you've shown this incredible vulture work that Linda is carrying out. But Pamela's asked Linda, why do we not know very much about the old world vultures and their bacteria? Is it that there just hasn't been enough research in this field compared to the New World vultures in the Americas?
Yeah, I think, Melissa, you answered the question there. There's just been no research done on it. And I think that is a huge gap. But I suspect, as I mentioned in the talk, that convergent evolution would have taken care of that, and we will be surprised at what we find in the microbiome of vultures, old world vultures.
Absolutely, and let's hope that that field gets looked into after your incredible talk this evening. Now, a relatively simple question, and I hope you've got the answer lined up. Dr. Llewellyn Taylor is asking, what is the pH of the stomach of a vulture?
That is a very good question, and I can't believe I didn't mention it. They've done studies on the Ripples vulture in East Africa, and their stomach pHs were found to be as low as 1, which, you know, if you have any scientific training, that is about as low as you can go.
Thank you so much, Linda. Yeah, highly, highly acidic, and certainly...
I mean, sorry, Melissa, to put that into perspective, the human stomach pH is between 4 and 5. Sure. That should give you some perspective on how acidic a vulture stomach is.
Incredible. Certainly dealing with that rotting meat and those tough conditions that they tend to thrive on. Now, I see we've got one of our previous speakers in the audience this evening. Great to have you with us, Rob Simmons. If you missed out on Rob's webinar a few weeks ago on the cats in Cape Town, I'd highly recommend giving that a watch. But before we digress, back to vultures, Rob's asking with regard to your comments around the competitive release of mammalian scavengers. Did Darcy Ogada's study actually look at the impacts of this on the African mammals where she excluded vultures? And can we see evidence of these increases in hyenas and jackals here in Africa where we've seen declines in our vulture species?
Rob, I don't think Darcy's paper addressed that, no. And if I have to think of that, you know, if I have to go out and determine that in South Africa, I can already detect a number of obstacles in trying to quantify that. You know, first of all, things like jackal are shot in large numbers wherever they go by farmers. So it will be very difficult for us to find a correlation between increases in vultures and increase in jackals, for instance, and vulture declines. Another obstacle, you know, is it's very difficult to link directly vulture declines to disease or explosion in mammals numbers, because vultures move around a lot, especially the juveniles. They are incredibly mobile. So there are a lot of obstacles, and you know, diseases may also be surveyed very effectively, which will also mask the effectiveness of vultures. So that was a very rambling answer, but I hope I answered your question.
Thanks, Linda. Michael Potts has got a question here, and he's just complimenting you on a superb talk, and I can see a number of chat feeds comments coming through to the same tune, so well done again. But he is asking what would you, in your opinion, say is the biggest threat to vultures today? And he's put there, obviously, poisoning seems to have a serious impact, but what are some of the other threats that you touched on that are really driving our massive declines in these birds?
Well, I mean, you can't exclude poisoning. 60% of vulture mortalities are due to poisoning in its various forms. But then I have personally also witnessed very high mortalities due to collisions with power lines. There are other things like persecution. I mean, I'm dealing with a situation in the Northern Cape, for instance, now, where farmers are threatening to start persecuting vultures because they are perceiving them to be feeding on their livestock, killing their livestock. And they drown in farm dams, especially in the drier regions of our country. But yeah, it's mainly poison and collisions, unfortunately.
Thanks, Linda. You walked us right into another question from Rob Simmons, which I was going to save for a bit later. But he's asking about the role of vultures as predators and if there is any evidence towards this. So would you please just expand on that statement?
Thanks, Melissa. Under the bus I go. Look, vultures are raptors, and as much as any raptor who is a true-born predator will sometimes resort to scavenging, I think we should also accept the fact that as much as vultures prefer to scavenge, they may also sometimes revert to predation if the opportunity presents themselves. They are known to predate animals that are weakened, very young animals such as lambs or things like that, and obviously animals that have been weakened by drought or disease or whatever the case may be. So unfortunately, yes, it is the case. I must stress, however, that if you look at a vulture's physiology, a vulture is not made or designed to be a fearsome predator. They lack the very strong claws that you see in something like a martial eagle. Vultures have got very flat feet, and that obviously allows them, because they move around on the ground a lot, around carcasses. They lack those powerful claws that an eagle has that will help them to kill a prey. So I doubt that they'll ever go for healthy and strong prey that is able to evade them. But yes, unfortunately, I think they will sometimes attack animals that are weakened or vulnerable.
Thanks, Linda. A very good answer there. Now, we know in the times of a global pandemic, being conscious of diseases and disease transmission, and of course the cures to those diseases, is always a hot topic. And Peter Archdale here is asking if you could say a word around the impact of Invermectins on vultures. And just before you do, Linda, for those of you who aren't aware, there's been a lot of interest in Invermectin, which I believe is a deworming drug used on a lot of livestock. And this obviously has been taken prophylactically by some, as well as reactively by others who have been infected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And there is some evidence that this may in fact be a potential assistance for people who are infected with COVID, but those studies are still currently underway, so we can't conclusively say that yet. But do you know of any sort of interactions or impacts of Invermectins on vultures?
No, unfortunately not. I've not read anything on that topic. My apologies.
No stress. And hopefully it's not the same as the diclofenac, which is commonly found in our Voltarens and anti-inflammatories. Now, we've got a question here from Penny Abbott, who is one of our regular listeners. And hello again to you, Penny. Thanks for always tuning in and always having some insightful comments and questions. Penny's saying there's obviously a limit to what our vultures can do. In the example of mass die-offs during a drought, for example, vultures are not necessarily going to be able to deal with all the carcasses under these types of conditions. And is it likely then that, I'm guessing she's leading on to saying that maybe we'll see increases in mammal scavengers alongside them under that kind of condition?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've personally been in Kgalagadi, and that was in 2010. I traveled to Kgalagadi, and there was a great die-off in, now the name of the animal eludes me. Anyway, there were mass die-offs in antelope, and they were just lying all over the place, and they were all bloated and rupturing in the sun, and the vultures were just overwhelmed completely. And but what I also think is, scavengers are mobile, whether they're mammalian or avian, and maybe there will be local increases in mammalian scavengers to deal with the glut of food that is available. But of course, once that glut dies off, those scavengers will quickly find themselves without food and they will move off.
Awesome. Alan Bedford-Shaw's got an interesting comment here, and I think you'll speak to this a little bit around the Indian vulture population. So he's been using diclofenac anti-inflammatories for a sore shoulder, and we wish you well with that, Alan. Hopefully it gets better soon.
Voltaren, yes.
Yes, Voltaren, as it's more commonly known to most of us. But he's asking, what were the Indians using it for in such quantities that it then wiped out large portions of their vulture population? And can you just elaborate on that use, please?
Look, diclofenac is just the name of the chemical, and it was used in a wide variety of anti-inflammatory drugs. So diclofenac is not necessarily the name that it was marketed under, but it would have been the main active ingredient in a number of different anti-inflammatory drugs that would have been marketed at that time. So it wouldn't have been a single product.
Thanks, Lidan. Do you know if any sort of alternatives have been introduced across India to try and mitigate this threat?
The only known anti-inflammatory drug that has been tested to be non-harmful to vultures is a substance called meloxicam. Again, that's not its market name, that's just the active ingredient. So especially in something like my vulture safe zone, that is definitely the anti-inflammatory drug that I require vets to use if they ever do treat some of the game on a farm.
Brilliant. And Penny's just confirmed here it was an earland die-off that she was referring to, potentially the one that you observed as well.
Yes, thank you, Penny. That was the word I was looking for. Thank you.
Fantastic, thanks. An interesting comment here from Robin Hurd. We obviously know that there is traditional medicine trade in our vultures and belief-based use. And so Robin's asking whether this trade in vultures may affect how diseases are spread from those vultures themselves to potential users of these products. Do you have any comments?
Yeah, very much. It's a very controversial topic, but something that definitely raises a concern. It's obviously not just the diseases that these vultures may carry, but also the poisons that are sometimes used to kill these vultures, which are then in the vultures, and then they are sold to people as meaty.
Brilliant. Thanks, Linda. And I think our last question for the evening, I see we have gone just past 8 o'clock, and this one's going to come from one of your colleagues. Christian Brink, tuning in tonight, is asking, can you speculate around the use of antibiotics in livestock and whether any evidence is showing that this has an impact on the gut biome of vultures that may have longer term impacts on their ability to do what they do?
Christian, I must be honest with you, this is something I know very little about. I do know that in the guidelines that are set out for people at vulture restaurants, that it's preferable that these animals that are put out at vulture restaurants have not been treated with antibiotics within a prescribed period of time prior to being put out at these vulture restaurants. But in terms of the effect on the vulture gut biome, I really don't know.
Brilliant.
But it is harmful, which I do know.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Christian, for that great question. I'm afraid, ladies and gents, that we have actually run out of time this evening, but Linda, that was absolutely fascinating, and thank you so much for sharing it with us in such an easy to understand and accessible and visually appealing way. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure all of our audience did. If you do have any other questions for Linda, I'm sure she will be happy for you to drop her an email, and you could also drop it to the conversations@birdlife.org.za web address, and I'll happily forward those on to Linda if there are any burning questions we didn't manage to get to this evening. Otherwise, I'm going to wish you all well tonight. Don't forget to tune in next week, same time, same place. From me, it's a good night. And Linda, thank you so much. If you'd like to say any last words, you have the floor for a moment.
No, thank you for having me. It was great fun.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for tuning in, everyone. Keep those eyes on the skies and keep enjoying those birds. I'll see you back here, same time, same place next week, Tuesday, 7 o'clock, and hopefully sans any techno gremlins next week. Keep safe out there, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.